The spread of standardized civic infrastructure across the Western world in the mid-19th century followed a predictable pattern. Cities adopted similar street widths, drainage systems, and public building designs as communication networks expanded and engineers shared knowledge through professional societies and published journals. But the timeline compresses in unexpected ways. Between 1820 and 1850, over 40 cities across North America and Europe implemented nearly identical municipal water systems, using the same pipe dimensions, valve specifications, and distribution logic, before telegraph lines connected most of these locations. The engineering drawings show matching architectural language. The procurement records reference the same material standards. The maintenance protocols follow parallel administrative structures. These weren't neighboring towns copying each other. These were cities separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and weeks of travel time. The synchronization appears faster than the available communication infrastructure should have allowed. This is an investigative documentary. We're not presenting conclusions. We're examining a pattern in civic history that feels compressed when you look at the dates, the distances, and the level of technical coordination involved. Everything discussed here is based on archived records, engineering documents, and municipal histories. The goal is observation, not accusation. The official explanation holds together on its surface. Professional engineering societies did exist. Technical journals were published and shipped internationally. Architects traveled. Knowledge spread through letters and apprenticeships. But when you map the adoption dates against the available communication networks, something feels tight. In 1825, Philadelphia installed a municipal water system with pressurized distribution and standardized valve assemblies. By 1828, Boston had implemented an almost identical design. By 1832, similar systems appeared in Baltimore, New York, and Cincinnati. The engineering wasn't just similar in concept. It was similar in specification. Pipe diameters matched. Valve thread patterns matched. Maintenance schedules matched. And this was happening before railroads connected these cities. Before reliable postal routes ran between them. Before telegraphs existed. Take the Erie Canal. Completed in 1825, it stretched 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo. The lock system used standardized dimensions, 90 feet long, 15 feet wide, with uniform lift mechanisms every few miles. But here's the friction. Those specifications weren't iterative. The canal didn't start with experimental locks that were refined over time. The dimensions were standardized from the beginning across the entire route, as if the engineers already knew the optimal parameters. And within 5 years, canal projects in Ohio, Indiana, and Pennsylvania were using the same dimensional standards. Same lock sizes. Same chamber depths. Same operational logic. No central authority mandated this. No federal engineering bureau existed to distribute these standards. The projects were funded by different state governments, designed by different engineering firms, and constructed by different labor forces. Yet the infrastructure emerged uniform. The pattern repeats in municipal gasworks. In the 1830s and 1840s, American and British cities began installing gas lighting systems for streets and public buildings. The infrastructure required complex underground distribution networks, miles of cast iron piping, pressure regulation stations, and storage gasometers. The designs weren't just conceptually similar. They were dimensionally identical. Baltimore's gasworks, completed in 1830, used the same pipe threading standards as London's systems from 1828. Philadelphia's gas mains, laid in 1835, matched the diameter specifications used in Manchester 2 years earlier. Cincinnati's distribution network, finished in 1843, followed the same pressure regulation logic as systems in Boston, New York, and Birmingham. These weren't modular components ordered from a single supplier. Each city cast its own pipes, built its own gasometers, and trained its own maintenance crews. But the underlying standards were uniform, across cities, across oceans, across regions with no direct communication. It's not that knowledge couldn't spread. It's that the speed of standardization seems ahead of the speed of communication. Consider the administrative structures. By the 1840s, Dozens of cities had established departments of public works with nearly identical organizational hierarchies. Commissioner of Streets, Superintendent of Water, Inspector of Buildings. The job titles matched. The reporting structures matched. The record-keeping formats matched. These weren't colonial outposts copying a metropolitan template. These were independent municipalities developing parallel bureaucracies without direct coordination. The consistency feels deliberate, but the mechanism isn't clear. In 1838, New York City published its first comprehensive municipal code, a legal framework governing building heights, street widths, and construction standards. Within 3 years, nearly identical codes appeared in Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore. By 1845, versions existed in Cincinnati, St. Louis, and New Orleans. The language wasn't just conceptually similar. Entire sections were worded identically, down to the clause structure and numerical specifications. Legal frameworks usually evolve locally, shaped by specific geographic and political conditions. But these codes read like copies, distributed across cities with different populations, different economies, and different governance models. And this was happening before the telegraph, before fast printing presses, before professional associations had the infrastructure to distribute model legislation. The timing compresses. By the 1850s, the pattern had expanded to include fire departments, police systems, and public health boards. The administrative models were uniform. The rank structures matched. The operational protocols followed the same logic. It's not that these systems shouldn't have spread. It's that they spread evenly, across regions, across economic conditions, across political contexts, without the expected geographic clustering or temporal lag. The infrastructure appeared as if rolled out by a central authority. But no central authority existed. The scale mismatch becomes harder to ignore when you look at what these systems were designed to handle. In 1840, Buffalo, New York had a population of approximately 18,000 people. That same year, the city completed a municipal water system with a capacity to serve 80,000. The reservoir held millions of gallons. The distribution mains ran through undeveloped districts. The valve network extended into areas where no buildings existed. This wasn't a modest overestimation. This was infrastructure built for a city 4 times larger than the one that funded it. And Buffalo wasn't unique. Cincinnati's waterworks, completed in 1839, were engineered to serve a population of 120,000. The actual population at the time was 46,000. Cleveland's system, finished in 1841, had capacity for 60,000 residents when the city held fewer than 17,000. Milwaukee's infrastructure, laid in 1843, was scaled for a metropolis that wouldn't exist for another 2 decades. These weren't wealthy cities building monuments to ambition. These were frontier towns, recently incorporated, operating on limited budgets. Yet they commissioned infrastructure that wouldn't be fully utilized until after the Civil War. The engineering documents survive. The projections were explicit. The systems were intentionally overbuilt, not by 20 or 30%, but by factors of 3, 4, sometimes 5. What? The official explanation points to optimism and foresight. City planners anticipated growth. Engineers designed for future demand. Municipal bonds were easier to approve if they promised long-term capacity. But the scale feels uniform. City after city, across different regions and economic conditions, all overbuilt by similar margins. All projected similar growth curves. All committed to infrastructure that wouldn't pay for itself for decades. The pattern doesn't feel like independent optimism. Feels like shared certainty. Look at the Erie Canal again, not just its dimensions but its capacity. When construction began in 1817, the canal was designed to handle commercial traffic volumes that didn't exist. The western territories it connected were sparsely populated. The agricultural output was minimal. The trade routes it anticipated wouldn't materialize for years. Yet the canal was built wide enough for two-way barge traffic, deep enough for fully loaded freight vessels, long enough to justify 83 locks across 363 miles. By 1825, when it opened, it was immediately operating near capacity. The traffic volume that was supposed to develop over decades appeared almost instantly. Goods flowed. Towns along the route expanded. Within 5 years, the canal was handling the exact volume it had been dimensioned for. It's as if the infrastructure didn't predict demand. It enabled demand that was already waiting. The railroad systems followed the same logic. Between 1830 and 1850, over 9,000 miles of railway track were laid across the United States. The routes connected cities that barely existed. The freight capacity far exceeded available cargo. The passenger accommodations anticipated travel volumes that hadn't yet emerged. But here's the friction. The track gauge was standardized early. By 1835, most American railroads had settled on a 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge, a specification inherited from British rail systems, which themselves had inherited it from coal mine tramways. There was no federal mandate, no engineering consortium, no central authority imposing uniformity. Yet the gauge became standard before the national rail network existed, before interstate commerce required interoperability, before anyone knew how large the system would become. The standardization came first. The need followed. In Britain, the pattern mirrors itself. During the same period, British cities were installing sewer systems designed for populations that wouldn't exist until the 20th century. London's Metropolitan Commission of Sewers, established in 1848, designed a network capable of serving over 3 million people. The city's population at the time was 3 million. But the system wasn't just oversized. It was architecturally complex. The tunnels were built with vaulted brick ceilings, reinforced foundations, and maintenance access points every few hundred feet. The engineering reflected long-term thinking. Infrastructure meant to last for centuries. And within a decade, similar systems appeared in Manchester, Liverpool, Birmingham, and Leeds. Same architectural language. Same dimensional standards. Same maintenance logic. These were independent municipal projects, funded by local governments, designed by different engineering firms. Yet the resulting infrastructure looked like pieces of the same system. The storage infrastructure compounds the pattern. Across American and British cities in the 1830s and 1840s, massive grain elevators and warehouses appeared, structures capable of storing harvests that hadn't been grown yet, from farms that hadn't been cultivated yet. Buffalo's grain elevators, built in the early 1840s, could store over 1 million bushels. The agricultural output of the surrounding region at the time was a fraction of that. The infrastructure was built in anticipation of a farming boom that wouldn't fully materialize until the 1860s. Chicago's warehouses followed the same logic. By 1850, the city had storage capacity for commodities that wouldn't flow through the region for another decade. The infrastructure was in place before the farms, before the rail connections, before the economic conditions that would justify it. It's not that these investments were irrational. It's that they all bet on the same future at the same time with the same confidence. The administrative systems scaled in parallel. By the 1840s, cities were establishing municipal archives, record-keeping systems, and bureaucratic structures dimensioned for populations far larger than their current size. Philadelphia's Department of Public Works, created in 1844, maintained filing systems for infrastructure projects that wouldn't be built for 20 years. Boston's Board of Health, established in 1848, had administrative capacity for tracking epidemics in a city twice its size. These weren't paper plans. These were functioning institutions, staffed and funded, managing systems that hadn't yet been built. The bureaucracy preceded the need. Look at the street grids. In the 1830s, dozens of American cities laid out street plans that extended miles beyond their developed boundaries. The grids were surveyed, legally recorded, and formally adopted, even though most of the streets wouldn't be paved or built for decades. Washington, D.C., a street plan designed by Pierre L'Enfant in 1791, was fully surveyed and legally established by 1820, when the city's actual population was fewer than 14,000 people. The plan anticipated a capital of over 200,000, with grand boulevards, monumental spaces, and infrastructure nodes that wouldn't be constructed until after the Civil War. Similar patterns appeared in Detroit, Indianapolis, and St. Louis. The street grids were finalized early, often before significant settlement occurred. The plans weren't iterative. They were comprehensive from the beginning, as if the final form was already known. The postal infrastructure adds another layer. By 1840, the United States had over 13,000 post offices, more than the entire rest of the world combined. These weren't informal mail drops. These were formal postal stations with standardized administrative procedures, record-keeping formats, and operational protocols. The system was dimensioned for a level of correspondence and commerce that hadn't yet developed. Mail routes extended into territories where populations were sparse. Sorting facilities existed in towns that barely qualified as settlements. Yet the infrastructure was uniform. The forms were identical. The procedures matched across regions separated by weeks of travel time. The coordination feels tighter than the available communication networks should have allowed. Whether this reflects inherited administrative knowledge, parallel development under similar economic pressures, or something else entirely depends on how you interpret the evidence. But the evidence itself isn't disputed. The infrastructure was oversized. The timing was compressed. The standardization was uniform. And it all happened in the same narrow window, between 1820 and 1850, before the telegraph, before the railroads were fully connected, before the institutions existed that could coordinate this level of synchronization. The pattern invites examination. The label people use to describe it is what comes next. The word Tartaria appears on European maps from the 16th through 19th centuries. It wasn't a single nation. It was a geographic label, a catch-all term for the vast territories stretching across Central Asia and Siberia, regions that European cartographers knew existed but hadn't fully explored or categorized. The name itself derives from Tatar, referring to various Turkic and Mongolic peoples who inhabited these areas. On old maps, you'll find variations: Tartary, Tartaria, Great Tartary, Chinese Tartary. The borders shift depending on the mapmaker and the era. It was never a formal political entity. It was a placeholder, a way of saying lands beyond our current administrative knowledge. By the late 1800s, as mapping improved and colonial powers formalized territorial boundaries, the label disappeared. The regions were reclassified under modern nation-states. Tartaria vanished from maps not because it was erased, but because it was replaced with more precise geographic terminology. That's the historical record. The modern reinterpretation is different. Over the last decade, the term Tartaria has been revived online, not as a geographic label but as an explanatory framework. It's used to describe the patterns we've been examining: the synchronized infrastructure, the overbuilt systems, the compressed timelines, the administrative uniformity. For some, Tartaria represents a hypothesis about inherited infrastructure. Systems built by an earlier, more advanced civilization that 19th-century societies repurposed and claimed as their own. For others, it's a metaphor, a way of naming the discomfort that arises when official timelines feel too neat, when development patterns seem too coordinated, when the scale of infrastructure doesn't match the scale of the society that supposedly built it. And for others still, it's simply a label for anomalies that don't yet have a satisfying explanation within conventional historical frameworks. Three interpretations exist, and none of them require abandoning documentary rigor. The first interpretation: the infrastructure wasn't overbuilt. It was inherited. The cities of the 1800s were rebuilding, repairing, and adapting systems that predated them. The standardization wasn't coordination. It was preservation of pre-existing technical languages. The compressed timeline wasn't miraculous development, it was rediscovery. This interpretation treats Tartaria as a stand-in for an earlier, technologically sophisticated period that conventional history hasn't fully accounted for. The second interpretation: the infrastructure was built in the 1800s, but under conditions we don't fully understand. Economic incentives, knowledge-sharing networks, and material supply chains were more advanced than surviving records suggest. The synchronization resulted from parallel innovation under similar pressures, not from inheritance or conspiracy. This interpretation treats Tartaria as a metaphor for gaps in our understanding of 19th-century industrial coordination. The third interpretation: the infrastructure is exactly what conventional history describes: ambitious, optimistic, occasionally irrational projects driven by speculation, competition, and the economic booms of the era. The patterns feel strange only when viewed selectively. The full context resolves the anomalies. This interpretation treats Tartaria as a misreading of normal historical complexity. All three exist in current discourse. None of them involve accusations. None require hidden truths or suppressed evidence. Their interpretive frameworks apply to the same observable patterns. The infrastructure exists. The timelines are documented. The scale mismatches are recorded in municipal archives. What remains unresolved is why, and whether that question even requires an answer beyond conventional historical explanations. Return to 1816, the year without a summer. Volcanic winter. Crop failures across the northern hemisphere. Widespread social disruption. And then, within a decade, this explosion of synchronized infrastructure development. Whether those two facts are connected, whether the timing is coincidental, whether the period reflects recovery, opportunism, or something else entirely, that's where interpretation begins. Tartaria, in its modern usage, isn't a claim. It's a label applied to the unease that arises when familiar history is examined closely and the details don't settle as comfortably as expected. The evidence invites examination. The questions remain open. The infrastructure still stands, overbuilt, synchronized, and dimensioned for futures that somehow arrived exactly on schedule.